Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for being here and giving me such a warm welcome. Now you already know who I am and what this talk is going to be about. And I'm going to try to do this as practically as possible. So, like, wild animal suffering tends to be pretty abstract. We know very little about it and seems to be morally very demanding, but I'll try to do my best to make this a very illustrative talk and very applicable, at least. And to that end, I want to start with a story, because all good talks start with a story, I was told. And this story is about me being in college. I was majoring in philosophy, and I met this other student who was also doing philosophy. And when you're a vegan, like, one thing leads to another, and you're talking about veganism, right? And it turns out this guy, he used to be a vegan, but wasn't anymore. And when I asked him, why did you start eating meat again? And he said, well, basically it's because of the lions. And I was like this dude, he seemed pretty smart. Like, this was not the answer that I expected, because as you probably all know, this is defensive omnivore bullshit bingo, I think field A1, if I'm correct. So yeah, I was not expecting that. But he said, well, if it's wrong for us to eat meat, why is it not wrong for the lion to eat meat? And if you say it's wrong for the lion, I mean, this is clearly absurd. Like, then also by extension, veganism has to be absurd, and that's why I started eating meat again, because I don't want to be an absurd person. And I had a couple of responses, because I was vegan at the time, and I was not gonna let him off easy on this one, especially on lions. So I was like, well, this is the naturalistic fallacy. You're clearly saying that if lions do it, then it's okay for me to eat meat, right? Like, you can't argue that. Basically, lions, they also, like, they rape their females and they kill the cubs of other lions, of like rival lions. Do you also say this is okay? And he said, that's not what I mean, right? I mean, if it's wrong for us, why not for them? I'm not saying because of the lions it's okay for me to eat meat, but as a vegan, you would have to hold that this kind of predation is also wrong. I find that absurd, because you would have to campaign for, like, predation to stop, or like stop lions yourself in the wild. Like, this cannot be the answer. Therefore, I stopped being vegan. And I was not out of ammunition yet. Like, lions are not morally responsible. There's clearly a difference between me eating animals and the lion eating animals, right? Like, I'm a moral agent, I can think about this, and the lion just can't. Whereas we are. And he said, that's exactly my point. We are moral agents, and therefore, if we see a moral wrong, we should stop it. I mean, if you see, for example, another, like, non-moral agent doing harm, for example, a small child about to hurt another child, it's probably your obligation to stop this child. You're not going to be angry at it. You're not going to be like, hey, why do this? It's wrong because it's not morally responsible. But still, you would try to stop the bad thing from happening, right? The same thing goes for, like, earthquakes. You're not going to be angry at, like, natural processes, but you still don't want these things to occur, and therefore we don't like earthquakes. Like, this is a thing that we don't regard as particularly valuable. And then I said, well, this maybe he's onto something, but I'm not finished yet. So I said, well, they just have to do it. I mean, the toddler, to survive this toddler who's about to hurt another toddler, it doesn't have to do it. But lions, they can't be vegans. And he said, well, that might be true, but you certainly don't find necessity necessarily, like, convincing when it comes to moral wrongs. Like, you don't find it permissible to, for example, kill someone to get a life-saving organ for yourself or, like, a family member. Like, even though it's necessary for you, like, to kill this particular person in order to get the organ in some circumstances, you don't find this permissible. Like, necessity doesn't justify all things as morally good in all circumstances. And at this point I was stumped. Like, these were the three answers I could come up with. Maybe you have more, but I was pretty stumped. And I was imagining him, like, having his own bingo sheet, like, where he was, like, ticking off all the vegans that he met, like, all these kind of answers that they come up with. And I have to say that he was not saying that these things are necessarily equally bad. So if I eat an animal, it might be worse than the lion eating an animal because I can like reflect about me eating this animal, whereas the lion doesn't have the capacity. But like this doesn't get the lion off the hook necessarily, right? Because we can still regard it as bad and try to stop it as we, for example, try to stop other horrific things, like for example, plagues from spreading. Like this is something that we don't want and therefore stop it. Not as equally bad as a murderer, but still something we don't want in the world. So I felt I was faced with two options. So the first one, like accepting that veganism was absurd because it implied caring about wild animals. Like I should find the line morally abhorrent, and that's clearly absurd, therefore veganism is absurd because it follows from veganism that I should care about this. And the other option was starting to care about wild animals. And like from me being here and the title of the talk, you could probably deduce which option I chose. Like I looked into this. I was like, okay, maybe this guy is onto something. And then I realized a couple of things. So first of all, caring about wild animals, it's not clearly absurd. Like on first look, as probably most of you right now, like this seems to be absurd. But it might not do so on a second look. The other thing is, it's more pressing than I could ever imagine. Like this is the thing that we should really look into once you start to look into it. And the third thing is that there is something that we can do about it. So I'm like, this talk is about these three things. Why it's not absurd, why it's a very urgent topic, and what we can do about it, or what some ways are to think about these issues. So let's start with the first one. Caring about wild animals is not absurd. There's very little that you need to not find this absurd. The first one is that, well, suffering matters morally to some extent. You don't have to find this to be like the most important thing in like your space of values or the things that you care about, but like it does seem to matter when like sentient beings are in distress, when they're starving, when they're like horribly killed. This seems to be important. At least in the animal rights movement, this seems to be a consensus that like suffering might not be the most important thing, but it's at least to some extent important. And then anti-speciesism demands that we treat equal suffering equally. So to the extent that, for example, humans suffer and there's another sentient being, for example, I don't know, a cow, and it suffers equally, like we should treat these things equally because we don't discriminate based on speciesism. And what follows from this is very, very simple. To the extent that we should help human beings who are suffering in the wild, we should do the same for animals. Because we should treat suffering equally, and to the extent that humans suffer in the wild, to the same extent, if this happens to animals, we should also do this for animals. And this is a little bit abstract, and I promised you that this was going to be a practical talk, so there is a thought experiment. It's one of the best things about doing philosophy. Let's imagine we're in this, like, for example, rainforest, and there's an earthquake that has devastated this village of like a native community, and we come across this, and there's clearly families in distress, like they need pain medication, like everything's just a big mess, right? And we certainly have the urge to help. Like we think this is important, that we should intervene here and try to help to the best extent that we can. It might be the case that we can't help because we're not a doctor, we might mess up horribly, right? But we have this urge that these people are in dire need of help, right? That this is something that we should care about and try to help. And if this holds for human beings in the wild and we're anti-speciesist, we should feel this, or we should have the same moral judgment about, for example, a community of zebras being in distress in the wild. Like there's no fundamental difference about us, like at least having the urge and like the moral responsibility to try to help. Like what kind of interventions are feasible, we're going to look into like at the end of my talk, but at least having this like idea of, okay, like we have the obligation to do something about it, or at least think about how we can best help. And this is a very uneasy and wide-ranging conclusion. Like this would, whoever has been to a science talk knows that like there are many animals, and this would be very wide-ranging. So we should be hesitant. You should be hesitant after the first 10 minutes of this talk. And so we're going to look at some objections. The first one might be, well, humans can communicate that they want help, but animals just can't. So how do we know, right? And this sounds very similar to people who argue along these lines when it comes to farm animals. I mean, how do we know that they don't like this, right? I mean, it's just very difficult to assess these kind of situations. And that's true, but still we can infer some things about like the preferences of animals probably. Otherwise you guys wouldn't be here if you think like factory farming. I mean, can we really know? Apparently we can to some extent. Also similarly, what was if the earthquake killed all the adults in this community and all that was left was like babies who couldn't talk to us? We would still regard it as like our obligation to care for them because we can like infer probably that they want our help. The same probably also goes for animals who are in distress. And then we can say, well, these are natural processes and therefore inherently good. And perhaps some are, right? I'm willing to grant that some are inherently valuable. But probably diseases aren't. Like this would be, I would have to severely revise my moral framework, and probably you would as well, if we regarded diseases as natural, as inherently valuable. And also our behavior is different when it comes to humans who are suffering, right? We override this tendency to find nature inherently appealing when it comes to humans who suffer from disease, who are trapped in nature, etc. And even if it was valuable, it would probably have to be weighed against the kind of suffering that we find in the wild, right? It's not a trump card to say it's nature, therefore it's all good. That doesn't seem to be the case. The third thing is that, well, intervening in the wild means forcing our value judgments onto animals. And again, this sounds a little bit like people who want to justify factory farming and say, well, how can we enforce our will upon these beings who now exist? Like this is clearly, we cannot do this. How do we know even what they want? And I think this is wrong. I think that, first of all, we do this, for example, with other beings like children. We enforce certain values that we find valuable about ourselves, about the world, onto our children, even though they're in no way can they're defenseless against what we think is a good thing for them. Like we behave as their guardians because we know, or we seem to know what's good for children. Otherwise, we would have to throw out parental care out of the window. And also, non-intervention also seems to force a particular set of values onto these beings. So for example, if a friend asked me, can you help me with moving? Otherwise I would have to get a moving company to help me. If I say no, I don't want to intervene in your moving process, I'm basically forcing him to get a moving company, right? Non-intervention does not, if we know the consequences, it does not absolve us from forcing people into certain directions, right? So we should always be very vigilant when it comes to non-intervention and look at the consequences of non-intervention as well. But we could just be, well, I mean, perhaps that's just what they want. That's just we know that they don't want intervention and therefore we shouldn't intervene and help them. But that, again, I think is implausible. If you look at humans, they don't think to have just a singular need to be left alone. If they're in need for help, they don't want to be left alone. That's why they're in need of help, right? They tell us, hey, I can't do this on my own, I need help. So they have a more complex set of preferences than just being left alone. And also, it seems to be that in the wild, being left to your own devices does not particularly help animals to make the best out of their life. A lot of them are not left alone by wolves, for example. If we leave them alone, the wolves are not going to care that some animals just want to be liberated. They're just going to eat them. This is wolves don't care about these particular things. And if we want to maximize the kind of things that animals can do in the wild, that's probably not the status quo, right? Because a lot of them die from diseases when they're young. So this is not particularly granting them autonomy or anything, because if you're dead, you don't have any autonomy. So keeping animals alive in the wild seems to liberate them to some extent, at least if that's what they want. So even on that metric, I think intervention might be justified, as it is with humans in some cases. And then we could say, well, they don't really suffer, right? And if we want to object by saying that, we have to look at the kind of thing that is the life in the wild, right? And I think there is sufficient reason to be worried if we look at it, and we're going to do so in a second. But if that's like our last excuse, that's an empirical question, right? You would say, well, if there is suffering, then at least we should care. So to that extent, that becomes an empirical, not a moral question anymore. And after I looked at all these objections and kind of reasons for intervention, like I thought at least looking into it, like what's the life in the wild like, and is it so bad that it might justify intervention at some point, right? And that's what we're also going to do now. And I think it's more pressing than I could ever imagine. Like, I think the kind of wilderness that we're exposed to is not an accurate picture, and we're going to have a look at that. It's more pressing for two reasons. So the first one is that the numbers are just astronomical. So here, as a reference class, we have humans with 7 billion individuals at any one point, and then livestock with 24 billion. That's not the 70 billion because that's per year. This looks at like a particular point in time, because chickens are like, you have multiple chickens per year, but if you look at a particular point in time, it's roughly 24 billion. And then we get to land birds in the wild, and these already like trump humans and livestock combined. Like, it's already more. Then we have land mammals. It's 100 billion to 1 trillion. And don't think elephants or lions, think more like rats and squirrels and these kind of animals that you don't like associate normally with like nature documentary, because these are the kind of mammals that are like most prevalent in the wild right now. Then we get land reptiles and land amphibians. So that's 1 trillion to 10 trillion. So already that's like, yeah, I don't even know how to communicate these kind of numbers. And then fish, 10 trillion to 1 quadrillion. I had to look that one up because I just didn't know what 10 to the 15th power was. And then bugs or insects, that's 1 quintillion to 10 quintillion. So again, a lot of individuals. And if that much is at stake, we should at least bother to look into what kind of lives they lead, right? Because otherwise, I think we're just careless at this point. And the other issue why it's more pressing than I could ever imagine is that the suffering is just intense. And I mean, some of you will know this, but others won't, so I'm gonna like briefly go into this. So the first issue is predation. So, oh, sorry, short disclaimer, there are going to be some horrific images. This is probably too late, but at least now you know, sorry. So this is a lizard disemboweling a rat. This is probably not nice. Then you have disease. This is a rabbit suffering from myxomatosis. You have skin tumors, you go blind, and then you die typically after 14 days of contracting it. Then you have starvation. This is probably man-made suffering in the wild, right? But there are also a lot of animals that just starve because there's just not enough food, right? This is just a natural occurrence as well, that they, like, it's not as easy as living in a city, for example, to find food in the wild. And then you have parasitism. So that's wasp larvae injected into a caterpillar, and they feed on the organism until it dies, and they're born, right? And these things are not the exception, but they're the norm. And like, as you can guess, this would be strictly forbidden under even the lax animal cruelty laws that we have in most countries right now. Like, these kind of deaths, like, you would go to jail for this. They would not be asking twice why you did this. This would just be your straight to jail card, and this happens on a regular basis. And like, this might be different from what you saw in nature documentaries, and David Attenborough, the famous nature director, he said, people who accuse us of putting in too much violence should see what we leave on the cutting room floor. So even what you see there, like, if it is these kind of pictures, that's not like the extent to what's actually going on. And now I've prepared a video exactly of these kind of clips that are often left on the cutting room floor. And I was torn whether I should do this, But I know that for a lot of us, like seeing firsthand the kind of suffering in factory farms was what got us involved into this struggle, right? And I think that it's equally important to see what's going on in the wild, because it can be quite distressing. And this is, again, now this time a very serious disclaimer. If you don't want to see this, and there are going to be horrific pictures, please leave, and we will tell you when you can come back. Like this, like you can also leave while the footage is playing, but again, I'm very serious about this. It's just horrific. I hope at least that it works. Probably not. Sorry about this. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Parasitised caterpillar has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fat. The glomerata wasp larvae lie just under its skin. Each is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight.
I can't believe it. Look me. She was pregnant. Oh my goodness. Ach, no man. Oh shit. Aye, that's a pity, eh? Who would have expected that one?
Zo helemaal leeg gegeten. Kijk eens op hem. Hij is aan het vechten van het hoofd van de Ipana.
Thank you for watching this. I know that this is very difficult, but this is just the big stuff that you can catch on camera, not the small stuff that mostly happens. And I mean, you could still say probably, I don't know who would, but I mean, you could still say that at least life in the wild is okay. You know, these are all just death scenes, perhaps, I don't know, it's just worth it. I mean, on balance somehow. So we should look at the life in the wild, I guess. And the most important thing to really realize here is that evolution doesn't optimize for well-being, as you clearly saw. Like, it's just not that it wants these animals to feel good all the time, or that for humans to feel good. What it's really optimized for is replication of genes. So, and the organisms attached to these genes are like very elaborate machines to facilitate that most of the time. And when you want to do that, there are two relevant variables to really be successful at passing on your genes. Right? The first one is the number of offspring. So that's basically, if you're faced with it, do I want more replications of these genes rather than less? All else being equal, more offspring is generally good. And the second is the survival rate, right? All else being equal, you want more of these offspring to survive into reproductive age, because then, again, they can replicate. And you should know that there's a trade-off here, right? Like, you can only be a helicopter parent to so many children. Once you have 10, it's really difficult to care, like, really deeply about any, like, or like as carefully than if you have just one offspring. And you can see that in so-called survivorship curves. Again, we saw this slide or this graph already, but I'm going to quickly go through it. So type 1 humans, there it says, they maximize survival, right? So on the left, you can see percentage of organisms surviving, and on the x-axis, you see time. So imagine all the kind of like people that were born on your birthday, right? Probably many, and many of them are still alive, like the majority of them. But once you like proceed even further, all of them are going to die eventually. That's far to the right. But most of them are going to make it into their 50s, 60s, and 70s, or only some, fortunately, are going to die very early. And like this comes at a certain cost, right? You can see that humans have very few offspring, that's why they can care about these, and many survive off them. On the other hand, you have frogs, they're type 3 survivors, and there you have the opposite, right? So at this point in time, only 10% are left. Note that this is a logarithmic scale, so it's not linear, but only 10%, after this fraction of time, only 10% of the offspring are still alive. And they compensate by maximizing the number of offspring. So for frogs, it's typically up to 20,000 of them. And then obviously it becomes harder to care for 20,000 children. You're just not going to be a good parent at that point, right? And these two things, they loosely, not perfectly, map onto R selection and K selection for those who are familiar with these kind of terms. So type 1 tend to be like K selectors, and type 3 tend to be R selectors or R strategists. And type 2, they're just squarely in the middle, right? So they have a decent number of offspring, and a decent number of them also survive. And like this talk, I don't say that frogs chose this particular way of life and that they're just bad parents. Like these kind of strategies are just more or less adaptive in certain circumstances. Like recently, some frogs tend to care more about fewer offspring, right? Because there's adaptive pressure for this particular behavior. So these things are not like set in stone. And then we have to look at what kind of lives do these particular types of animals have. And let's start with type 1, right? So that would be K selectors. And they maximize survival, and that's good, right? Survival is generally a good idea. And they have relatively good lives, right? What does that mean? Well, you have a relatively long lifespan where you can enjoy your life, your parents care for you, and you have a relatively stable environment in which not a lot of surprises are gonna catch you off guard. And when I mean relatively good, you saw the footage, these were also K selectors, it can be bad for you as well. But then we have to look at type 3 or R selectors, right? And they maximize the number of offspring. What does that lead to? So firstly, they have relatively short lifespans. So this is a tadpole being eaten right now. They also have hardly any parental care. So these turtle babies are left to fend for themselves. They're often already picked apart by birds of prey once they try to reach the water, and the parents are just far, far away. And lastly, they have a very unstable environment, and there are often a lot of disruptions, etc. They often live on the frontiers of land and water, etc., where it's just good to have many offspring so that some can survive this unpredictability, right? Because if you have just one and there is an unpredictable thing going on and it dies, that's a bad thing. So you often find that these are adaptive and unstable environments. And again, to make this more illustrative, let's look at the population dynamics of this particular selection. What does this mean? Well, you have the parental generation at point T1. They have a lot of offspring, as I said, typically 20,000 or up to 20,000. And then if you assume that populations stay constant at point T3, you have the new parental generations, and there are just 2 left, right? Because otherwise we would see toad explosions all over the place. I mean, toads explode sometimes, but the different kind of toad explosion, I guess. And so what we can infer from that is that most of these at point T2, they die before they reach reproductive age, right? And this is similar to the fate that chicks have in factory farms, right? They are born and they're torn from life after a couple of days and are just have no chance whatsoever. And these are usually not the type of animals that you associate with the wild, right? It's fish, it's amphibians, etc. It's the R selectors, not the K selectors. And but that doesn't mean that their suffering doesn't matter, right? Frogs clearly matter, or at least their experiences do. And if we look at this now, right? So what's predominant in the wild? I mean, if K selectors have it reasonably well, and R selectors, or most babies of R selectors don't, what's the trade-off here? Perhaps it just evens out. And then we have to look at it. I mean, K selectors, what kind of animals are we talking about? Mostly big mammals. So you saw the picture with the whale, you have humans, you have primates, etc. And you have some birds, right, who also have this particular survivorship strategy. And then you have animals who are in between, as you also saw in the graph, like it was this linear thing, most birds, some smaller mammals, and some reptiles and amphibians. And then you have our selection, most reptiles, amphibians, fish, insects, and some smaller mammals like rats and squirrels. And the numbers, if you remember from the earlier table, like most big mammals are not a lot of mammals, right? Like the majority of mammals are like made up by smaller ones, and the majority of of the entire animal population is made up by reptiles, amphibians, fish, and insects. So these are kind of animals that are actually suffering to like a large extent. And this is because, I mean, the big mammals have relatively few offspring as well, right? It's no wonder that they don't bear the brunt of the suffering because there are just so few of them. And I mean, you could probably argue that this got even worse because like there are fewer big mammals than there used to be, right? There are fewer elephants, fewer whales, etc., and probably more ocelectors nowadays. And that's why our selection probably dominates the equation, right? That's why we should care about this, because so many babies are actually dying. And I mean, there are a lot of caveats here that I could mention, right? These are like, a lot of more research has to be done on this. We acknowledge that. But what seems to be clear, at least at this point, is what Richard Dawkins said, and that is the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites, thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. And I mean, probably now you're as depressed as I am here on stage. But there is hope, right? At least that's what keeps me going. So what can we do about it? And I mean, some things we are already doing. And I'm not necessarily endorsing the kind of things I'm showing you now, but there is concern for animals and there is intervention already, and maybe we can learn something. So the first thing is animal rescue. Some probably heard the talk, right, about animal rescue in the wild, and this is like probably a good thing, but we just don't know. But in general, at least there are some people who care about these animals in the wild. For example, when there are forest fires, earthquakes, etc., veterinarians are dispatched, and people just like care and seek funding for this. You have vaccination programs. These are biscuits with rabies vaccines for foxes in continental Europe. I mean, this was for like human purposes because rabies also sucks for humans. But like, it was probably also good for the foxes, right? They didn't contract rabies. So this is another thing that one could look into. You have feeding programs, right? For example, for birds. You have feeding programs also for deer and for squirrels sometimes. Again, originally this was probably intended for human purposes, for example, hunters. But again, it doesn't have to be, right? These things can help us figure out what kind of interventions might work in the long term. Another thing that's being done is population control. And like this just sounds crazy, but with feral cats, we seem to assume that it might be okay. And also with a vegan diet, you're also engaging in population control because you're preventing other beings from like existing in the first place, which we seem to agree might be a good case. Like if I turn vegan, there's no one going into a factory farm and saving a pig. Like you guys do it and that's great, but that's not gonna happen to all the animals in factory farms, right? So there is some extent to population control already going on. But we shouldn't stop there, right? And there's some things that we can do about it going forward. The first one is probably the most important one, that's acknowledging the awful track record of human intervention in the wild. Like, I know that some people, or like a lot of people, have reservations about this, because humans have fucked up again and again about this, and we should be very careful when we do this and when we talk about this. Because it's like, these are very complex systems, we acknowledge that. It's not easy to do this, but if so much is at stake, should we not at least try or find out? Like, this seems to be important. At one point, people said the same about medicine. Like, human bodies are incredibly complex and intricate. Like, it's so easy to fuck up the human body, but still, we applied ourselves. Like, we got hundreds and thousands of people onto this, and now I think we're doing reasonably okay. We're still improving, but even with complex systems, you can achieve progress over time. The next thing is that we should convince other people of the urgency of this topic. Like, you don't have to agree with me on this, but at least acknowledge that there is a problem out there and that we should talk about it. Whatever your conclusion is, like, you should at least think about this very, very hard, whether you're willing to accept the kind of suffering that you saw in the pictures, on the videos, and that I detailed. Like, this is not a trivial issue. And this probably also goes for, like, environmentalism. You currently have conservation biology, and maybe we should have a trend towards welfare biology, because conserving the suffering in the wild might not be the best idea. I'm almost finished. The third thing is that we should fund and conduct research. Like, I cannot reiterate this enough. This is the crucial thing, right? Before we go out there and do anything, because it is so complicated, because we did so many bad things in the past, we should find out what we can do and what can work. And this is also what we're doing at Sentience Politics. We have started the first research project on wild animal suffering, where four full-time researchers are actually trying to find out what's possible and what's actually going on. As I said, there are many unclear things, and we're trying to get some light into the dark. Questions that we're concerned with are, for example, are vegans, vegetarians more likely to want to help wild animals? Or am I wasting my time here? I hope not. Please assist us with this particular project, that it's not a failure. That we should assess the welfare of wild animals. Did I just talk, like, was that stupid what I said, or is there actually something to this? Then agriculture and wild animals, is it impacting them in good ways or in bad ways? The same goes for climate change and wild animals, good ways, bad ways. We're also planning to organize the first conference dedicated to wild animal suffering, where all those people who think this is an important issue can come together and collaborate on this important topic. And lastly, we can continue our efforts to spread awareness, because, like, I think this is a very pressing topic. I hope this talk made this clear. And if anyone's interested in collaborating on this or has inputs, please approach me. Like, look at our website, get in contact, because this is important. And yeah, I hope you learned something, and at least you carry this topic on, think about it, and hopefully reach a good conclusion. And with this, I conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bless you.
Other questions?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot. It was a very inspiring new perspective, I find. I'd like to come back to the point where you said that some people think everything which is natural is inherently good. Personally, I would argue that good or bad doesn't apply outside of human thinking. So the problem seems to me that in most of the cases you showed, in the examples you gave, one animal's suffering is the way that another animal survives, and the only way that it can survive, which would make the biggest difference to human beings. We nowadays can survive without eating animals, and maybe even could survive without harming hardly any. We could reduce it, we can reduce it. But for a parasite, it seems impossible. Except for doing the science fiction idea of creating artificial animals for parasites to infect, which of course is in theory possible. But it seems that suffering and diseases also and illnesses, that they all play a certain kind of role in a certain system, which up to now usually we have indeed destroyed rather than supported. So if we take away the food from the lion starves. If we take away the ant from the parasites starve, all this kind of stuff. And the question is then if not suffering indeed is a part of nature as we know it, and if not at this moment we're so far away from understanding it that messing with it would be really quite pointless. And the last point, sorry, maybe it's too many things, but it triggered a lot of responses. I also find that it's about responsibility. And of course, as human beings, we're responsible for what we are doing in the first place. So it seems that this is what we should solve, because this is where we are actually messing things up before we start attacking the parasites. Thank you.
Yeah, I think all the points that you mentioned were valid. I think I would just draw different conclusions from them. So you argued that, well, right and wrong does not exist out of human thinking, and I would agree, but we still seem to think that, for example, when an earthquake hits and people are dying, we regard that as wrong. And you can think about whether you think the kind of suffering that you find in nature is right or wrong. That's not like, you shouldn't accuse the lion of being a murderer because it won't listen to you, it doesn't understand you, but you can still like form moral judgments about the kind of things that are happening, right? I think that's important. Sure.
I think there is a difference between having a moral response and acting upon it, which is great. Like, for example, helping a wild bird which has fallen out of a nest. Yeah. I think anybody could do that, and it's a good deed you can do. Yeah. You want to do it. It's like an expression of your personal moral feeling you want to help, of compassion. But there seems to be a big difference between helping an individual from another species because you feel compassion to actually trying to really change a system, to really remove suffering from a whole species, from a whole system. There is a big difference in that. The one thing is really you yourself doing something at this moment for one individual. Yeah. It's like, for example, we're watching and the lions are attacking and we see a small elephant and we decide, no, we want this elephant to live. We do this because we personally get involved emotionally. It doesn't mean that it would be good to stop all elephants from being eaten. Those, for me, seem to be two different subjects.
Yeah, I hope that like what most people take away, for example, from factory farming and seeing this video, and where they feel immediate compassion, is that they should still care about all animals in factory farming as well, even though they don't have a personal connection to them. So I think the same holds for this kind of suffering that you have in the wild. You only can feel compassion for individuals, but could still extend that by like thinking about it and whether you ought to care or want to care about these other individuals as well. So I think you should just extend this and like make this and cultivate this moral feeling towards these individuals. And I'm just going to respond to your second point about like it just being so complicated and what do we do if we like abolish predation, what's going to happen then? And you're exactly on track. Like, what are we going to do then? We have to find out. We have to find out whether there are feasible interventions. I think we have to look into it. And if this talk provoked you into looking into it, I think that's a good thing. I think just giving up when confronted with immense amount of suffering is not the right response. I think one can feel hopeless and depressed, but one shouldn't feel. You should just try to do as much as you can. And when that's little, that's okay, but I think we can make a big difference, and then that's even better. Probably.
Two things. First thing, shortly, I also think that the first question we have to ask if animals should be helped is if the distress that is imposed on them is caused by human beings. But I won't argue now with the moral argument, but with another argument, because it is not per chance that there is R&K strategy. It's evolutionary development, and it's the more creatures are capable to flee or to cope with the animals, the fewer is the number of their offspring. So that's a continuous continuity. And we also are in that continuity, extremely K strategy. But we have changed the biosphere for our convenience. So it's our species that has to take us back.
So to your first point, I already said that, so a human killer is probably worse, or it's a worse moral thing for him to do than the lion, right? I think this is, like, you can make a distinction because, between human violence and animal, or like non-human animal on non-human animal violence. Please let me finish first. Yeah. And, but you can still think that the one thing is like abhorrent and the other one is bad. You don't have to say like one thing is bad and the other thing is okay. Like you can have different kinds of bad, I think. And the other point is that you're right, that we're also case selectors and that we intervene in the wild for the worse, probably. But then we should probably first stop intervention and then think very hard about this. But just I think the first step is just acknowledging that there's a lot of suffering and that we should try to do something about it. If you agree to that point, I think that's perfect. If you then say it's hopeless, I would disagree. I just say we should look very hard.
For example, if there is a wild bird sanctuary and we build a street across that, we should stop that. But if there is a mother with ducklings and a fox mother who has pups and takes the ducklings, why should anybody interfere? So, for example, and the cameraman with the elephant and the lions, he probably had a gun, and he could, in that concrete moment, he had two possibilities: shot in the air and stop it, or make a film to see how cruel nature is. For example, we can also be cruel.
But that doesn't make it good, right? I mean, yeah, but I think next question, or are we out of time? I don't know.
Not really. One short one. Does anybody?
Yeah, thank you for this inspiring talk. My question would be, because you were talking in terms of suffering, and you were talking in quantitative terms mostly, do you also try to consider qualitative differences in suffering? So, depending on the phylogenetic sophistication of organisms, is that something that plays a role in your considerations, or is it just the sheer numbers? Because there might be a difference between an elephant calf being eaten alive and a caterpillar being eaten alive, probably in terms of the general suffering, also social related suffering.
No, certainly we would do that. I mean, this research is only in its infancy because humans didn't care for the welfare of animals at all. Therefore, they didn't try to find out whether, like, what they're feeling and how intense this was. And you have the problem of like other minds where you don't know exactly what's going on. But to the extent that we can infer like the kind of like inner lives of animals, we should try to do that and prioritize also based on that if we can find reasonable conclusions based on that. I think the research is still like out on this. I would probably also say that when faced with like an insect and an elephant calf, probably save the elephant calf first, just because the probability is just a lot higher that there's relevant suffering there. And we should just find out. Again, I can reiterate that, but I'm happy to take that on board. I think that's a very good addition to this. So yeah, thank you very much. If you have more questions, you can just come up to me or send me an email. My email address is down there. You can also call me, but that's a little bit weird, but you can still do it if you want. I don't know.
Thank you, Stefan.